She stood at the rehearsal dinner in a borrowed dress and my grandmother's pearls, making a toast about how grateful she was to have finally found a real family. 60 people in that room cried. My son looked at her like she hung the moon, and I sat at the end of that table with my hands folded and my face completely still. Because the woman I had been waiting 2 years to walk through that door had just parked her rental car outside, Simone thought she had won. She had no idea what was already in motion.
If you're watching this video, tell me where you're from or what time it is for you. I have been a school principal for 22 years. I know how to read a room, and I know how to read a person. You spend enough time watching children decide whether to tell you the truth, you start to notice the pause before the answer, the calculation behind the smile, the way someone performs sincerity versus the way they actually feel it. So when Darius brought Simone to Sunday dinner in October of 22, I was watching. She was beautiful. I will give her that with no hesitation. Tall, warm brown skin, natural hair pinned up just enough to look effortless. She wore a simple green wrap dress and small gold earrings, nothing showy. She brought flowers, not roses, not something generic. She brought dahlias, rust-colored dahlias in brown paper, like she had already studied what kind of woman I was and chose accordingly. She hugged me at the door. Not the stiff first meeting hug, a real one. Both arms, a slight lean in, a soft, it's so good to finally be here. And I felt it, that small warmth that comes when someone makes you feel seen. I noted it. I also noted that I had never told Darius I liked dahlias. At dinner, she was perfect. Asked about my years at Westbrook Elementary, listened to the whole answer, asked follow-up questions, talked about her work. She said she was a grief counselor in private practice, worked mostly with people who had lost a spouse or a parent. Said it with this quiet gravity, like the work had cost her something too. Darius watched her the whole time with this expression I hadn't seen since he was maybe 9 years old and had just read his first chapter book cover to cover. Pure wonder. I was happy for him. Genuinely. My husband, Gerald, had died of a stroke 18 months before that dinner, and Darius had taken it hard in the quiet way men sometimes do, not breaking down, just going thin. He stopped calling as much, stopped making plans, started working longer hours and filling the silence with momentum. Seeing him light up again made something loosen in my chest. But here is the thing I kept coming back to all evening, the thing I turned over in my mind while I washed the dishes after they left. Simone never asked a single question about anyone else. She answered everything perfectly. She had warmth and eye contact and follow-through. But in 3 hours around that table, she did not ask about Gerald, did not ask about my sister in Memphis, did not ask Darius a single question about his childhood or his friends or the years before he met her. She performed listening. But she was not curious. Not about us. I told myself I was being the suspicious older woman who can't let her son move on. I told myself I was projecting something that wasn't there. I dried the dishes and put them away and let it go. I should have stayed with that feeling. 6 weeks later, Darius called me on a Tuesday night. He never called on Tuesdays. I picked up and could hear it in his voice before he said a word, that specific kind of held breath, like someone trying not to smile while they're still talking. He said he had asked Simone to marry him over the weekend, and she had said yes. I said, "Baby, that's wonderful." And I meant it mostly. He talked for 40 minutes about the ring, about the restaurant, about how she cried, and how he cried, and how the people at the next table started clapping. I listened to all of it. I said the right things, and I meant most of them. 2 days later, Simone called me directly. Not a group call with Darius on the line. Just her. She said she wanted to reach out personally. Said she wanted me to know that she didn't take it lightly, becoming part of a family that had already been through so much loss. Said she had grown up without a stable mother figure, and that meeting me had changed something for her. She said, and I remember this exactly, I have always wanted someone to call Mom who actually deserved it. It was a beautiful thing to say. It landed the way it was meant to land. But something in the back of my mind said, that line has been said before. Not by her to me, by her to someone else, in a different city, with a different son. I did not know that yet. I just had the feeling. The wedding planning started fast. Simone had opinions about everything. Not in a difficult way, in a way that made you feel like the whole event was being thoughtfully curated. She had done research. She had saved photos. She had a specific venue in mind, a historic event space in our part of Atlanta called the Magnolia Terrace. Privately owned, full buyout required, seated capacity for 150 guests. The deposit alone was $45,000. I want to be clear, I went into this with open eyes. Gerald and I had built a comfortable life. I had a pension, some investments. The house paid off. I was not a wealthy woman, but I was a stable one. And when Simone mentioned quietly that her own family was not in a position to contribute, said it with that same quiet gravity she used when talking about her grief counseling work, like loss was a language she spoke fluently, I heard myself say that I would handle it. Darius started to object. Simone put a hand on his arm. Your mother wants to do this, baby. Let her. I covered the deposit, then the dress, $22,000, for a custom gown from a designer in Savannah, 3 fittings required. Then the florals, the caterer, the photographer, the rehearsal dinner venue. Every check I signed, Simone found a reason to squeeze my hand and say something that made me feel chosen. Like I was not just funding a wedding, I was being welcomed into something. I pulled from savings I had not touched since Gerald died. I liquidated a small investment account he had left me. I told myself it was exactly what he would have wanted. He loved Darius more than anything. He would have moved the earth for that boy's happiness. I did not tell Darius the full amount. I told myself that was to protect his pride. Looking back, I think I also knew, somewhere below the surface, that if I said the number out loud, it would sound like what it actually was. By the time I was done, I had spent just over $94,000. I was at morning service in late January when Sister Patricia from the hospitality committee stopped me in the fellowship hall. We were making small talk about nothing particular, and she mentioned her cousin in Birmingham had gotten involved with a woman who had cleaned out her cousin's savings and disappeared. Engagement ring, joint account access, gone within 6 months of the wedding. She said the woman's name was Simone. I felt the hair on my arm stand up. I asked a few careful questions. Sister Patricia said her cousin described a tall woman, natural hair, worked in some kind of counseling, said she had come into the cousin's life right after he lost his mother. I thanked her and smiled and walked to my car and sat in it for 10 minutes. Then I started searching. I spent the next week looking for any Simone involved in fraud cases in Alabama. I found a few names, but none with photographs that matched. I pulled at threads that went nowhere. I showed Darius a couple of photos under the pretense of just browsing social media, and he said none of them looked like Simone. I started to think I had made something out of nothing. That was the false trail. It cost me a week and more anxiety than I needed, because Simone was not her real name. I was looking for the wrong person entirely. But that conversation with Sister Patricia was the thing that cracked the window open. Even when the search went cold, I did not close the window again. Darius's condo was a 20-minute drive from my house. He had given me a key 2 years before because I watered his plants when he traveled for work, and I had never needed to use it unannounced until a Thursday afternoon in early February when the caterer sent over a revised contract that needed a signature before 5 o'clock. I let myself in quietly. I could hear Simone's voice from the kitchen. The door was mostly closed, just a few inches open. I thought she was on a video call. I heard her say, The timeline is fine. I told you. 4 months post-ceremony. Joint access is established. We trigger the transfer protocol, and I'm done. I stopped walking. No, he doesn't know anything. Look, he's not complicated. He's a grieving son who wants someone to come home to. His mother is the one who could be a problem, but she's been easy to manage. Very eager to be liked. Silence. Then, she already gave us 94. There's a pension and a house. Paid off. After the marriage, if she decides to be generous with her son and daughter-in-law. A small laugh. We're looking at a much larger second stage. I was holding the caterer's envelope. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingers. I already have the account number. I pulled it off a check she signed at the florist. I can have the routing information by end of week. I backed out of the apartment. I pulled the door shut with both hands to keep it from making any sound. I walked down 2 flights of stairs instead of waiting for the elevator. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 38 minutes. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that. I sat there, and I felt the full weight of what I had just heard move through me like cold water. My hands were completely still on the steering wheel. At some point, I noticed the caterer's envelope on the passenger seat, and I thought, I never got the signature. Then I thought, that's not the problem we're solving right now. I drove home. I made tea. I didn't drink. I sat down at the kitchen table where Gerald used to do the crossword puzzle every morning, and I started writing a list. The list took me most of the night. Every inconsistency I had brushed off over the past 4 months. The way Simone's origin stories shifted depending on the audience. Raised by grandparents in Macon, then raised by an aunt in Charlotte, then briefly it was a foster family in Tennessee before she seemed to catch herself and pivot. The way she always paid for small personal items in cash. The way she never introduced a single person from her life before Darius. No old friend, no former colleague, no one who had known her before this chapter started. The way her grief counseling practice had no website, no reviews, no listed address. I had asked once, casually, and she said she kept it intentionally low profile because her clients valued discretion. I had accepted that. I wrote it down now. I wrote down, she already has my account number. I stared at that line for a long time. Then I went to my laptop and transferred the majority of what was left in my main checking account to a secondary account she would have no access to. Set up a new routing. Called the bank in the morning to flag any unusual activity on the old account and put a block on external transfers over $500. If she tried to move money before I was ready, she would find nothing but a wall. I did not sleep. Around 4 a.m, I made a fresh pot of coffee and I sat in Gerald's reading chair with my grandmother's pearl necklace in my hand, the one I had been planning to give Simone on the wedding morning, as something borrowed. And I thought about what it would take to dismantle this carefully and completely, not quietly. That was the key. I had watched Darius defend this woman every time I raised even the softest concern. He had told me twice, kindly, that he understood I was still grieving his father and that he hoped I could trust his judgment. He meant it. He was not being cruel. He was a man in love with a fabrication, and fabrications are built to survive quiet conversations. They collapse under public, undeniable truth. I needed something he could not rationalize away. I needed a witness, and I needed a plan. I called Donna Perkins on a Friday morning. We had worked together for 12 years before she retired. She had been the district HR director, and she knew more about background verification than anyone I had ever met. She had access to a service the district used for staff hiring, one of the serious databases with civil court records and alias tracking and photo matching. She owed me nothing, but she also knew I did not call people with nonsense. I told her what I knew. She listened without interrupting. She said, "Give me 48 hours. She called back in 36. There was no Simone Garrett with the right profile anywhere in the southeastern United States, but a facial recognition match through the photo I texted her pulled from Darius's Instagram before I thought to ask, came back with a name. Kezia Drummond, 31 years old, last known address, Orlando, Florida. 2 prior fraud investigations, one in Louisiana, one in South Carolina. The South Carolina case had resulted in a conviction, reduced to 2 years probation after a plea. The Louisiana case had been dropped when the primary complainant withdrew. Both cases involved women. One involved a romantic con on a widower. One involved a financial fraud using a false professional services business. The business was a grief counseling practice. I wrote down everything Donna told me. I thanked her. I asked her to email me the full report when she had it formatted. The email came the next morning. I printed it twice, put one copy in the fireproof box where I keep Gerald's death certificate and the deed to the house, put the other in my purse. I finally had her real name. That changed everything about what came next. The background report listed Renata Wills as a complainant in the Louisiana case, the one that had been dropped. Her name appeared with a partial address in the New Orleans metro area. I found a phone number through a people search service. It took me 3 days to decide whether to call. I called on a Wednesday evening. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "My name is Loretta Beaumont. I'm in Atlanta. I believe a woman named Kezia Drummond is engaged to my son, and I think you may know her by a different name." Silence. Then, "What name is she using?" "Simone." A long exhale. "Where is she?" "Atlanta. The wedding is in 11 days. The silence that followed had a different texture. It was not shock. It was something older than shock. When Renata spoke again, her voice was even, careful, the way a person sounds when they have rehearsed their feelings about something for a very long time. She told me the whole story. Kezia had come into Renata's orbit 2 years before, posing as a grief counselor recommended by a community wellness center. Renata had recently lost her mother, a long illness, complicated by financial strain at the end, and Renata had been left with a modest inheritance and a lot of unresolved grief. Kezia had been warm, perceptive, professionally convincing. She had billed herself as a specialist in maternal loss. Over 8 months, Kezia had built a relationship with Renata that blurred professional and personal lines in ways Renata only understood in retrospect. She had encouraged Renata to move the inheritance into a grief recovery investment Kezia managed. She had made herself essential. When Renata began to sense something was wrong, Kezia had run a secondary manipulation, convincing Renata that her doubts were a symptom of unprocessed grief, not rational instinct. By the time Renata figured it out, $40,000 were gone. The Louisiana case collapsed when the plea deal in South Carolina got complicated, and the DA suggested Renata wait. She was still waiting. I asked her if she would be willing to come to Atlanta. She said, "I have been waiting 2 years for someone to tell me where she was." Donna emailed me on a Thursday to check in and ask if I had received everything. I wrote back immediately saying, yes, the report was exactly what I needed. The next morning, I went to find it in my email to forward to Renata. It was gone. Not in the trash, not archived, gone from the inbox as though it had never arrived. I searched every folder. I checked the sent items to see if Donna's address was correct. I tried to call Donna and reached her voicemail. I left a message asking her to resend. She called back 2 hours later. Her follow-up email, sent the morning after the original report, had bounced back as undeliverable from my address. I sat with that for a moment. My email password was stored in a note on my phone. Simone had been in my house twice in the past month for wedding planning meetings. She had used my bathroom. She had sat at my kitchen table with her phone face down while I made us both coffee. I had left my phone on the counter. I changed the password immediately. I contacted my email provider and requested a security review. They confirmed there had been an access from an unrecognized device 3 days prior. Kezia knew someone was looking. Maybe not who. Maybe not how much they had found. But she knew. I printed everything I had on hand. The notes I had taken during Donna's call, the partial records I had saved separately to a USB drive I kept in my car. It was less than the full report, but it was enough to start. And I still had Renata. I called Renata and told her to bring everything she had. Every receipt, every communication, every document. She said, "I have a whole folder. I've had it since month 2. For the next 10 days, I performed a version of myself I hope never to have to perform again. I went to the final dress fitting and said Simone looked like a vision. I sat in the florist's workroom and approved the centerpiece samples. I answered Simone's text about escort card fonts and rehearsal dinner timelines within 20 minutes every time, always warm, always engaged, always the devoted soon-to-be mother-in-law who had moved the earth to give her son's bride a beautiful wedding. Simone called me Mom 4 times in that period. Every single time I said something like, "Of course, sweetheart," and kept my voice exactly level. What I was actually doing was watching. I noted which vendors she had cultivated personally, the photographer, the event coordinator at Magnolia Terrace, the florist. I noted the way she positioned herself at every planning meeting so that she controlled the paper trail. The confirmations went to her email. The contracts had her name first. The vendor contacts in the event day folder were mostly her phone number. She was building her own infrastructure inside this wedding. If something went wrong, she could argue she had managed it. If something needed to disappear, she controlled the access. I let her build it. I did not touch a single piece of it because I had my own infrastructure in progress, and mine was going to be considerably more permanent. 3 days before the rehearsal dinner, I made a series of phone calls. I called the event coordinator at Magnolia Terrace first. I told her I wanted to flag a last-minute change in the payment contact for the remaining balances on the rehearsal dinner and certain wedding day expenses. I told her there had been a miscommunication within the family and that she should confirm final balances directly through the bride's dedicated business contact before processing anything. I gave her a number I'd confirmed Kezia used for secondary financial communications, a number that, based on everything Renata and I had reconstructed, Kezia controlled but did not actively monitor. Then I called the caterer, the florist, the photographer. Each conversation was brief and gracious and entirely convincing, because I am 61 years old and I spent 2 decades managing school staff and parent expectations simultaneously. And if there is one thing I know how to do, it is sound authoritative without sounding alarmed. Every vendor thanked me. Not one of them questioned it. The calls those vendors made over the next 72 hours would go to a phone Kezia would not be watching. The bills would go unpaid. The vendors would arrive at the rehearsal dinner with unresolved balances and rising anxiety, looking for someone to authorize payment. That someone would be the bride, and the bride would be very busy with other things. Renata drove up from New Orleans on a Thursday, 2 days before the rehearsal dinner. She was younger than I expected, late 30s, compact and precise-looking, dressed in a gray blazer and dark jeans, like she had thought carefully about what to wear. She shook my hand at the door with a firmness that told me she had been preparing for this trip for longer than 2 days. We sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours. She had brought a folder 2 inches thick, wire transfer receipts, email transcripts she had printed before Kezia disappeared, a photo from a birthday dinner one of Renata's friends had taken, candid, Kezia laughing, unguarded, not wearing the careful face she wore when she knew she was being observed. A copy of the fabricated professional license Kezia had shown Renata early in the engagement to establish credentials. A printout from the state licensing board confirming no one by that name or license number existed in their registry. We rebuilt the evidence file together on my kitchen table. I laid out what I had. She laid out what she had. Where they overlapped, we had corroboration. Where they diverged, we had range. I watched Renata's hands while she organized the papers. They were very still, not controlled still, the way my hands had been in the parking garage after the phone call, still in the way of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long that stillness is just their resting state now. She said at one point, without looking up from the folder, she told me my doubt was unprocessed grief. She told me I was using suspicion as a protective mechanism because I was afraid to let myself heal. She paused. I went back to therapy for 8 months, trying to understand why I couldn't trust people. It was never about trust. I was right. I did not say anything. I put my hand on the table near hers, not touching, just near. She looked up. "You're going to stop her." "We're going to stop her," I said. 2 days before the rehearsal dinner, Darius called me at 7 in the evening. He sounded tired in the specific way he gets when something is bothering him, and he is trying to decide whether to say it. He said the florist had called Simone twice that day about an outstanding balance. Simone had told him the florist was confused and that everything was settled. Then the event coordinator had called. Then the caterer. Simone had gotten quiet in that tight way she had when things slipped outside her control, and she had told Darius she thought someone was interfering with the vendor communications. He said it carefully. He did not say my name, but the space where my name should have been was very loud. I kept my voice even. I said, "Vendor miscommunications happen right before events, baby. Somebody's intern sent a memo to the wrong contact. I wouldn't read into it." "Simone thinks." He stopped. "What does Simone think?" "She's stressed." "People get stressed before weddings." "They do," I agreed. Silence. He said, "Mom, is everything okay?" And I said, "I just want you to have a beautiful rehearsal dinner. I want you to be present for it. Don't let administrative noise take you out of the moment." He said, "Okay." He sounded like he mostly believed me. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen for a while. That was the hardest call of the whole process. Not because I was afraid of being caught, because Darius trusted me, and I was keeping something from him, and the reason I was keeping it was exactly the reason it hurt. Because I knew him, and I knew that if I told him over the phone, or quietly, or without undeniable proof in front of him, he would choose her. Not from stupidity, from love. He was his father's son in that way. Gerald had always believed in people past the point the evidence supported. I was protecting Darius the only way he could be protected, by waiting until he had no choice but to see. I did not sleep Friday night. I sat in Gerald's reading chair with the lights off and the lamp from the street coming through the curtain, and I held my grandmother's pearl necklace in my lap. 4 generations. My grandmother had worn them to church every Sunday for 40 years. My mother had worn them to my father's funeral. I had worn them the day Gerald proposed, and the day we buried him, and the day I retired from Westbrook. I had planned to give them to Darius's wife, whoever she turned out to be, on her wedding morning. That was the plan since before Darius was born. A piece of this family passing into the next one. I had told Simone about them in December. I had described what they meant. She had touched her own collarbone when I talked about them and said, "Loretta, that is the most meaningful thing I have ever heard." I thought about how she had heard the value of that story and decided exactly when to use it. I thought about Gerald. I thought about what he would say if he were sitting in the other chair. He would say, "You already know what to do. You've always known what to do. You just wanted someone to tell you it was okay. It's okay, baby. Go do what needs doing." I held the pearls until my hands stopped being cold. The dinner was held at Thatcher House, a private dining room in Buckhead that we had reserved for the occasion. Dark wood paneling, candlelight, round tables set for 60. The Beaumont family, Darius's work colleagues, old friends from the neighborhood, people who had known Gerald, the people who mattered most. Simone arrived 20 minutes before the guests and moved through the room like she owned it. She greeted the staff by name. She adjusted a centerpiece. She touched Darius's arm with the easy ownership of a woman who has already decided the outcome. She was wearing my grandmother's pearls. I had given them to her that afternoon, at her request. She had texted me in the morning. I was hoping to wear the pearls tonight since we won't have another chance before the big day. Would that be okay? I had said, of course. I had driven them over myself. I needed her wearing them when Renata walked in. The dinner started well. The food was good. People were warm and animated, full of that specific joy that comes the night before a wedding when everything still feels possible. Darius gave a small toast, thanking everyone for being there. He looked handsome and happy and whole in a way he hadn't looked since his father died. Then Simone stood up. She thanked Darius first. Then she turned to me. She said, and the room went still for this, she said that she had come into this family without much of her own to offer, that she had been carrying old losses and old wounds, and that meeting Loretta had changed what she believed was possible. She said, she gave me more than a wedding. She gave me back the idea of home. 60 people in that room teared up. A few of them looked at me. I smiled. I felt my phone buzz once in my pocket. Renata had parked. She came in through the main entrance 7 minutes into the dessert course. Renata walked in like a woman who had driven 6 hours and had no interest in being subtle about why she had come. She was carrying her folder under one arm. She stood just inside the doorway and scanned the room until she found Simone. I watched Simone see her. The change was subtle enough that most people in the room missed it. A stillness. A recalibration. The way a person's face goes carefully blank and when their mind is running very fast behind it. Renata walked toward our table. The room noise dropped as people registered an unfamiliar face with an unfamiliar energy. Simone said, with her warmest smile, I'm sorry. Can I help you? I think you might have the wrong event. Renata set the folder on the table. She said, calmly and clearly, my name is Renata Wills. I live in New Orleans. 2 years ago, a woman named Kezia Drummond stole $40,000 from me while I was grieving my mother. She told me she was a grief counselor. She told me my doubts were a symptom of unprocessed loss. She looked directly at Simone. I think the people in this room deserve to know who they're celebrating tonight. The table went very quiet. Simone said, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know who you are. Her voice was still warm, still composed, still performing. Renata opened the folder. What followed was not a clean, dramatic scene. I want to be honest about that. It was messy and it was hard to watch, and there were moments where I was not sure it was going to land. Renata laid out the documents one at a time. The wire transfer receipts, the fabricated license, the email chain, the photo where Kezia was unguarded and laughing and completely recognizable. Simone tried 3 different responses in about 4 minutes. First, this is clearly someone who's been misled about who I am. Steady voice, sympathetic expression, speaking more to the room than to Renata. Second, when the photo went around the table, people can look alike. This is not me. I don't know this woman. Voice, slightly less steady. Third, when Darius picked up the fabricated license and held it next to his phone, where he had pulled up the real state licensing database. Darius, I can explain this, okay? I know how it looks. Things happened in my past that I'm not proud of, and I've worked very hard to... Her voice cracked. Real or performed, I still don't know. I am not that person anymore. You know me. You know who I am. She put her hand on his arm. He looked at her hand. Then he looked at the folder. Then he looked at me. and his face did something complicated, a question and an answer arriving at the same time. He stepped back from her hand, not dramatically, just back. That small movement went through the room like a current. Simone's composure cracked in a way I had not seen before, not shattering. She was too disciplined for that. But the seams showed. She looked around the table at 60 people who were very still and very focused on her, and I watched her calculate whether there was an exit that didn't close every door permanently. She was deciding whether to keep performing or cut her losses. She decided to keep performing. She looked directly at me. "You did this." Her voice had changed, not cruel, not loud, but stripped of its warmth. The real voice, the one I had heard in Darius's kitchen. "You have never accepted me. You could not let your son have something good without destroying it." She was good. Even then, even caught, she knew exactly where to push. Knew. I saw Darius hesitate. I will tell you what I had not anticipated. I had planned for Simone to fight. I had planned for the evidence to be overwhelming. I had planned for the room to be on my side by the end. What I had not planned for was how long the silence would last after Simone pointed at me. That specific, suspended moment where 60 people waited to see what my son would do. Darius was quiet for a long time, long enough that I could hear the music from the main dining room on the other side of the wall. Then he said, "What's your real name?" He said it to Simone. His voice was completely flat. She said, "You know my name." "What is your real name?" She did not answer. He looked at the photo again. He looked at the license database on his phone. He picked up the wire transfer receipt and looked at the account name on it. He set it back down. He turned to me. "Mom." His voice changed. "How long?" I said. "I heard her on the phone 3 weeks ago. I had the full picture 2 weeks back. And you didn't tell me. I tried to tell you in December that something felt off. You told me I was grieving and looking for problems." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted in his face. Not anger at me. Something older and harder than anger. The particular expression of a person who was realizing, in real time, that the story they believed was never true. He said quietly, "I told you to trust her." "You did." "I told everyone who looked twice that they were wrong." "I know." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Mom." His voice caught on the last word, just slightly. "I'm sorry I made you do this the hard way." I did not cry. I had promised myself I would not cry until we were home. I said, "You don't owe me an apology. You were in love." She made sure of it. Kezia did not go quietly. I had not expected her to. She made one final attempt. She turned back to the room, not to Darius, not to me, but to the wedding guests. She was still wearing the pearls. She spoke to people by name. She had paid attention to every person in that room over the past 4 months, and now she was calling in every piece of goodwill she had accumulated. "You know me," she said, to Darius's colleague Marcus, who had been at the engagement party. "You know the person I am. This woman is showing you paperwork from years ago and calling it who I am today." Marcus looked at his hands. She turned to Darius's Aunt Cecile, who had hugged her at every family gathering and called her baby. "Cecile, you know me." Cecile looked at the table. That was the moment Kezia understood it was over. Not when the folder went around the table. Not when Darius stepped back. When she called people by name and they looked away. Darius's cousins, Bernard and Terrell, stood up. They had not been asked. They just stood up, the way men sometimes do when something needs ending without being asked to end it. Bernard said quietly, "We're going to walk you out." Kezia picked up her clutch. She straightened her spine. At the doorway she turned and looked at me one last time. She said, "You spent $94,000 to keep your son from loving someone. I hope it was worth it. I said, I spent it to keep my son from being destroyed by someone who was never going to love him back. And yes, it was worth every cent. She held my gaze for one more second. Then she left. Bernard and Terrell walked her to the parking lot. They stood there until her car was gone. The room exhaled. Renata, beside me, set her hand flat on the table and let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 2 years. 3 months later, Darius sold the condo. He said he did not want to keep living in a space that had been designed by someone who was studying him. He moved into a friend's guest room in Decatur while they figured out what came next. He started therapy with someone his doctor recommended, a man named Dr. Osei, who specialized in grief and relational trauma. Darius called me after the 3rd session and said, he told me I've been in a state of protective numbness since Dad died. That's why she worked. I wasn't fully present in my own life. A long pause. I thought I was being functional. You were, I said, and you were also hurting. Those can both be true. He called me more after that. Tuesdays now, which used to be the day he never called. We had dinner every Sunday, something we hadn't done consistently since he was in college. He did not mention Kezia by name in those first months. He talked about his work, about a project he had been promoted to lead, about a trail he had started running on weekend mornings. He talked about his father more than he had in 2 years. He was coming back to himself, the way a person does, slowly, unevenly, then all at once in some moments you can't predict. Renata texted me in late March. The civil fraud case had been reopened. A 3rd complainant had come forward, a woman in Charlotte, who had found Renata's contact information through a community fraud awareness post. The case was moving. She said she did not need anything from me but wanted me to know. I wrote back, "Thank you for driving 6 hours. Thank you for being willing to be seen." She wrote back a single word, "Finally." The wedding deposits were largely non-refundable. The dress was a loss. The $94,000 is gone, and I do not expect to see any of it again, regardless of how the civil case resolves. I have thought about whether I regret it. I find I don't. Not because I think it was money well spent, but because I spent it believing I was doing something real. And somewhere inside that calculation, I was. I was trying to give my son what Gerald and I had. I was wrong about who I was giving it to, but the impulse was true. My grandmother's pearls are back in the fireproof box with the deed to the house. I haven't decided when they go to the next person. I'm not in a rush. Whoever she turns out to be, she will have to be someone who makes Darius curious about her, not just someone who knows exactly how to be looked at. There is a difference. I know it when I see it. Gerald used to say I could read a room better than anyone he had ever met. I think that was his generous version of the truth. The honest version is, I read rooms fine. I read strangers fine. I read my son so well that I sometimes forgot to read the people he loved because I was so focused on his face while he was watching them. That was the real lesson, not to trust less, to look more carefully at what I already knew was there. I am 61 years old. I am a retired principal with a paid-off house and a son who calls me on Tuesdays. I have a fireproof box and a pearl necklace, and the memory of a man who told me, every day for 33 years, that I was tougher than I looked. He was not wrong. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.